Composition and the basic principles of design. What is composition? It's the placement arrangement of visual elements in a work of art. It means putting together. A work of art is said to be aesthetically pleasing to the eye if the elements within the work of art are arranged in a balanced compositional way. This is a Kerry James Marshall painting called Pastimes. Another term for design is the word composition, which implies the same feeling of organization. Design basics. So compositional principles are guidelines and they're not rules. It's an art, not a science. They can be broken, the guidelines. If you break the rules, you should understand the principles and recognize how, in the interest of greater impact, they can be successfully transcended in specific instances. They're here to help you, the guidelines. So here's the principles of design: unity and variety, emphasis and focal point, scale and proportion, balance, including symmetry and asymmetry, rhythm and movement. So these are utilized to help artists and designers create compositions that are effective. Unity and variety. Unity means congruity or agreement exists among the elements in a design. Things look like they belong together, like they're connected. Oneness, harmony, gestalt, these are other terms that are used for unity. Techniques to create unity: proximity, repetition, and continuation. Proximity. To make separate elements look as if they belong together by placing them close together. We associate things that are closer together. So look at this. These areas appear closer together and we associate them together. And the word here, close edge, you can see when letters are spaced further apart, we no longer read them really as separate words. Here's another example of proximity where you see two different groups of forms. So it's not considered one thing, it's considered two separate things. Here's another example of repetition. This is Yayoi Kusama in her Mirror Room from 1991. She's an artist who does installation. Repetition in all the dots. Here's another example of repetition. Diane Arbus, these are identical twins, a photo from 1967. She's a photographer. This is continuity through patterns and grids. This is still unity. So a smaller pattern was continued here to create a larger pattern, was repeated. This is a grid that creates unity by Andy Warhol. It's a silk screen. Patterns can create unity. You can see here the shadows from the blinds are creating a feeling of unity, a feeling that things continue throughout this. This is a Stieglitz photograph. Continuation is another way to create unity. It means that something continues, usually a line or an edge or a direction from one form to another. So there's a line that goes around this beach. So we continue, our eye continues around this beach, following that line, because the eye has an instinct to follow a path, instinctively follows a path. Here's another example of continuation. We follow this line of faces down here and then down the trail to the water and then down to this mass. So we follow the path. Unity and variety. So this is a great example of unity and variety. These are all ropes, but they all look different. These are all forks and they all look different. So this is a great way to create interest in something, in a subject, is to find different elements of the same thing, but it's still unified. Emphasis and focal point. Designers, artists use emphasis and focal point to attract attention. Emphasis gives part of a design prominence. Here's a Rousseau painting, and often artists use light forms to draw emphasis away from dark areas, such as in the woman here. But, emphasis is partially subjective. A lot of people find that this object also draws their attention because of the different colors. So red is a vibrant color, and that's being drawn to this. I think it's a bird. How do we create emphasis or focal point? Through contrast, isolation, and placement. Contrast. So this item here shows contrast because a form is in a different position than the others. And this shows contrast in one, a textured form versus solid form, a small form versus a long form, a curvilinear form versus rectangular forms. This is an example of creating contrast through lights and darks in this Hakusai piece, this print. The lights here are creating contrast from the darker elements of the waterfall. Color difference creating contrast in this plant, in this bonsai. Isolation. So this can create emphasis as well. So the glass here is isolated from the rest of the glasses, or the elements here. The dot here is isolated from the rest of the dots there. This child here is isolated from the rest of the children. So we focus on the item that is alone, that is isolated. Also a great use of blurring the background here to create more focus on the item that is in focus, in the foreground. Placement, centering. By centering someone on the page, we create emphasis or a focal point. This is Barack Obama by Kehinde Wiley. Placement. So placing the two acorns closer to the camera creates emphasis on them. The audience looks at them first and then the background with the rest of the acorns. Also, depth of field. The elements in the background are not as in focus as the elements in the foreground. Placement. So we can create focus by placement. This is George Washington in the center of the room, and people are all looking towards George Washington. How to create emphasis or focal point with placement. Here we see a Jericho wrapped in the Medusa, a seminal painting by this artist, one of the only paintings by this young artist who died early. It says, if many elements point to one place, our attention goes there. So this, all our attention goes to the top of this triangle. And we'll see triangles again are pleasing in terms of composition to people. People like triangles. And we tend to go towards the top of the triangle. Also, we're taken over here because of this flag at the top of this side. And these people are all reaching towards this person. Scale and proportion refers to relative size measured against other elements or against a standard. So this fortune cookie is not in the normal size scale to the city, so we notice it. And here, how to use scale and proportion. Well, proportion is related to ratios. We judge proportions by relating an element to other elements and viewing them as correct or not, like that fortune cookie we thought was incorrect. Often proportion is related to emphasis. For example, if one figure is made to look larger compared to other figures in a composition, it is said to be out of proportion and is given greater importance or greater emphasis. The ancient Greeks desired to find ideal proportions. This was called the golden mean. So this is the rule of thirds. So this is how do you use subject placement in the rule of thirds? Well, this really relates to scale and proportions. And the rule of thirds, the total image is divided vertically and horizontally into 3 equal sections. Here you can see them divided horizontally and vertically. And generally, composition is strongest if the center of the interest falls near one of the crosshairs. So this crosshair kind of went up a little bit, but the crosshairs in this area or with the people. Some more rule of thirds examples. You can see that this flower is in one of the crosshairs, and so is this bagpipe person. And the crosshair is right near the top of this particular form, or near this particular crosshair. Another rule of thirds example. According to the rule of thirds, horizon lines should be either in the upper third or the lower third of the frame. So following those lines. In the same way, vertical lines shouldn't divide the frame into 2 equal parts. There's space to place a dominant vertical line either on 1/3 or 2/3 of the way across the frame, as in the boat example below. Otherwise, the scene may seem divided. Balance, symmetry. So this is elements that are symmetrical as a line of symmetry, and a butterfly showing symmetry. It gives a feeling of stability. Symmetry is seen in sacred geometry, which was used in the Renaissance by Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci. There's also placement centering here, but there's elements on the sides of the pictures are always symmetrical and balanced. Symmetry. Barclay Leonard Hendricks, Sir Charles. This is painting that shows symmetry. You can see this person's in the center, and not a direct symmetry because they're in different positions, but they are definitely symmetrical. More symmetry. Symmetry doesn't have to be perfectly balanced. Here's a Botticelli showing symmetry. And the two figures are not totally equally balanced, but they are balanced. Asymmetry before the ballet. You can see that it's more heavily weighted here, this particular picture, than on this side by these figures. But this foot, in terms of continuation, points over here and draws us around to the other people in the picture. More asymmetry, we see this large tree here in the Starry Night by Van Gogh. And on the other side, there's no large tree. But it's very well balanced by this bright sun. So how can you use balance? This is more about balance. This is about horizontal lines implying stability and vertical lines implying instability, and diagonals being dynamic. This is a Hokusai example of showing a dynamic diagonal. So create balance. So horizontal lines imply stability. Perhaps it's because we stand better on an even ground and they imply a landscape, while vertical lines like trees imply instability. Diagonals are considered dynamic. This is a Riviera painting showing a diagonal of umbrellas. Another Hokusai example of textural changes. So balance can be altered through value, color, shape, and texture. Objects that contrast will attract our attention and change the balance of a picture. We can create contrast through our use of value, color, shape, and texture. So the texture balances this larger form. This texture down below and also the texture in the sky balances this larger area. All-over composition. So this is a Murakami example of using an all-over pattern. There's no focal point, but there is a lot of repetition here. Rhythm and movement. Rhythm is created when one or more elements of design are used repeatedly to create a feeling of organized movement. Things look like they're in motion and moving in a direction. This movement is not as implied movement, it's not real movement in this Bridget Riley example. She's standing in front of her artwork. Here's some more things that show rhythm and movement. We have a photograph on the left and another photograph on the right. Both show movement in trees and in the hills. They appear to be in motion, but they are, it's implied motion. Other compositional techniques, a few more. Simplification, reduce details of unimportant areas, such as background areas. Use a limited value range, the range between your darkest dark and the lightest light within unimportant areas. And remove unnecessary subjects. So you can choose as an artist to get rid of things in your work to simplify them and create better compositions that are more effective. See, here's a nice simplification example. And notice how the background of the photo is blurry, reducing details. Well, you can do that in your work as well. It's a photo by Daisy Morse. This is the rule of odds, not to be confused with the rule of thirds. It suggests that an odd number of subjects in an image is more interesting than an even number. An even number of subjects produces symmetry, which can appear overly formal and unnatural. For example, if you're going to place more than one person in a photograph, don't use 2. Use 3 or 5 or 7. So here's an example of 3. Triangles, like I said before, they're pleasing to people, aesthetically pleasing. Creates a sense of stability and strength. You can see here in this Gentileschi piece that there is a triangular form. Breaking the rules. So there are some artists, like a local photographer, Uta Barth, who break the rules. A lot of her compositions are off-center, as you can see here. Things are cut off. She often places items like diptychs, like 2 pieces together like this. And she's definitely very conscious of the fact that she is breaking these rules. Here's an example of Andrea Bowers, a piece called Girlfriends. It's a graphite drawing and it's a diptych, and she often, you can see like she's cutting off people down below, or they're very small in the corner. But this is what makes her work very unique, is this larger page with a smaller person partially cut off. And here's a joke by John Baldessari, an artist who made this photograph with the text wrong printed underneath it. In photography, you're not really supposed to put a person with a tree coming out of their head behind them. And so he was making a joke by doing that. So that's the end of my composition lecture. Thank you very much.